I was saying, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 5th seminar of the Italian Reproducibility Network. First, let me thank you, the Italian Psychological Association, Associazione Italiana di Psicologia, AIP, for supporting these seminars and our activities. If you want also to support our activities, you can join the Italian Reproducibility Network, which has become recently an association. Or if you wish, you can subscribe to our mailing list and being updated with all of our initiatives. Another way you can support our initiatives are staying updated with us is to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now let me give you some organizational information about the Q&A session, which will follow the presentation of our today's speakers. If you can indicate that you want to ask a question by writing the word question within the square brackets in the chat, and we will give you the floor. Or if you prefer, you can write your question in English or either in Italian if you prefer, and we will read it aloud and translate it as needed. Also, if you are a PhD student, please signal it because we will give priority to your questions. So let me now introduce our today's speaker, who is Enrico Glerian from Aalto University School of Science, which is going to talk to us about open issues in data sharing. Some information about Enrico. Enrico is a staff scientist at the Aalto School of Science, a core member of the Aalto Scientific Computing Team. He helps researchers with the research software and teach massive online hands-on courses like Python for scientific computing and also hands-on on data anonymization. He is an expert in working with personal data in research. He trains and supports researchers with issues related to the GDPR, secure company workflows for sensitive data, data anonymization. He's a passionate promoter of open science, transparency, ethics, research integrity, and reproducibility. And also, he's a founding member of the Finnish Reproducibility Network. So, Enrico, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today.
And thank you for the introduction. You covered what I had in my slide already. Maybe one thing that I mentioned, my research background, I still do some neuroimaging. So once a week or a couple of times a week, I scan. But so yeah, my expertise in medical imaging, especially neuroimaging and fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. But yes, to the core of this talk, short talk, so that we can have more time for discussion. Maybe it's important to define the context first, that the context here is personal data collected for research purposes. They can be interviews, they can be brain images, like I just mentioned, questionnaires, I don't know, wearable devices that the subjects are wearing, all sort of data that you can collect from a participant. But this is important to talk about or to express this context because the rules and the procedures and the legislation are different for secondary use of health and social data. So what I'm saying here is the process that should exist for kind of research data that was collected for research purposes versus, other processes that different countries have when it comes to the secondary use of health data, which could be data from hospitals where the original purpose, was a medical purpose, but then later they can be reused. Or then also this registry data from National Statistical Institutes. Every state keeps, numbers and statistics, and then the process for reusing these is different than what I'm talking about here. All right, so the outline will be basically in 4 parts. It's good to always start with the why are we here? So why is it important to share data? Especially I will look at the perspective of ethics, law, and open science, but also the perspective of different players, the institutions, the organizations that often kind of hold the copyright of the data and the responsibility towards the subjects, but also the subjects themselves and the researchers. And then we outline few common issues and blockers that are basically, how can I say, preventing or not enabling the open sharing of personal data in Europe, at least. And then some step-by-step idea or like process from the idea from the very beginning before data collection down to the fully sharing and reusing of personal data. And finally, maybe some consideration if are all data worth sharing, because sharing data is expensive, and so this is also something that should be discussed. Maybe some references. Well, I don't have written references. I can fill this slide more later, but at least this is an updated version of a previous talk organized by the GMAC in the last June, and I put the link there. It's an excellent talk, and there are other speakers in that session, so it's definitely worth watching if you are interested in these issues. All right, so let's start with the core concept that transparency is at the core of research integrity. So the four main principles of research integrity according to the European Code of Conduct for research integrity are reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability. And so you see in the honesty, transparency is a key term. And transparency means that you need to, open every part of the research process, how you collected the data, what were the data. Transparency sometimes means that you need to provide access to the data during the peer review process or after the publication to verify that the claims are true, or even better to expand on top of those claims and bring new findings. And as I already mentioned, there's also the principle of reliability that explicitly mention reproducibility, this part of quality assurance that what you were able to demonstrate with the analysis, with the data you collected, is reproducible with the same data, or maybe with a new data set that can be collected following the same protocols. So at the core of ethics and the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that is basically what regulates the use of personal data in Europe, there is the core principle are protecting the individuals. In ethics, the principle of do no harm, and in GDPR in general, it's a regulation, it's a series of articles that clearly have the data subject in mind. They want to protect the data subject and not institutions or whatever. Of course, ethics and law are not exactly the same. In the ideal planet, they would totally overlap, but in practice, there are still some ethical principles that are not yet reflected in law, and something that could be considered legal, let's say anonymized data, where personal data doesn't apply anymore. So in theory, anonymous data could be openly shared. It's still maybe not fully ethical to openly share some anonymized personal data, especially if the new uses of this data would go against what the actual subject, gave you permission to use the data. And then, of course, into the picture, there's also science. And, ideally, we want to sit in the middle between science and ethics and law, and the border between these three concepts are blurry. So if we look at the data protection perspective, or in general the protection of the subject, there are different articles in the GDPR and also different ethical, whether they are national guidelines or also, like I'm quoting there, the Declaration of Helsinki, that clearly they want to put limits to what we can do with the data from an individual. So from the ethics point of view, we have the right to privacy. Every human person has the right, to privacy, and we need to make sure that that whatever research we do, it's done to respect the confidentiality of the information that the subject gives us. And then if we take the perspective of the law, And Article 5 from GDP, the GDPR basically defines all the principles, the 7 principles of the GDPR, and few of those principles are clearly touching on the issues that we're talking about here. So the 5B, which is the principle of the purpose limitation. So personal data is collected and used for a specific purpose. We can't, at some point in the future decide to reuse the data for a new purpose that is not aligned with the original purpose anymore. Or it's not that we can't, then we need a new process. We need to maybe be in touch with the subject, with the data subjects again, and update them on the purpose. But sometimes this is not possible because we follow basically the following principle, the data minimization. So sometimes we might collect data from individuals, and the data minimization principle is saying that we should keep the minimum amount of data that is needed. And often, even though, let's say in medical research, this might not be an issue because we keep records for forever about health. But when it comes to research data that is collected only for research purposes, sometimes or very often we don't need to keep the identity of the data subject just for the purpose of fulfilling the GDPR. And then if we still continue with the principle of the GDPR, there's also the storage limitation. So at least when it comes to open data, you might think of long-term preservation of data that will stay there forever and future generation will be able to analyze it. This is a bit in conflict with the GDPR. Of course, GDPR is not telling us a number of years, and after those years, the data should be deleted. It's just making us reflect that maybe something should not be there forever if it's clear that it's not needed anymore. And then finally, the integrity and confidentiality, which is very similar to what I was saying earlier, so the kind of the right to privacy. But then on the other hand, science is also telling us, that we need transparency. Like what I'm quoting is the European Code of Conduct of Research Integrity. So the issue here is this balance that, this ethical dilemma that how can we be transparent with our research projects, with our research data, give the data to as many researchers who want to verify or reuse our findings. But at the same time, we really need strong data protection to cause no harm to the subjects. So usually this type of ethical dilemma is you might get different answers according to the to the perspective of who is giving the answer. So of course, the perspective of institutions and also the aspect is that I've noticed myself when I organize workshop on this issue is that the study participants are too important, which is true. They are, nobody should come to a study and be exposed to a potential future risk of data leak that might cause true harm, financial harm, physical harm, or other, issues. So it's clear the study participants are important, but then sometimes this makes the institution kind of say, let's just not share the personal data because participants are too important. Let's take zero risks, and it's understandable. I'm not saying that it's bad. So often, if you read consent forms or other privacy notices, you read sentences like, "We will not share the data with any other collaborator in the planet." It's like only this research team, only these people listed in this consent form can actually see and use the data. Or something like all data will be confidentially stored only at the university secure storage system, so that it's so secret and it's so confidential that no one else can use it. And then if something bad happens, the key is lost, the data is lost as well. But then on the other hand, we also need to consider the perspective of the study participant. This might not be your average person, even though of course when we want to study human participants, we try to sample the population as well as we can. But sometimes these are motivated subjects. These are people that truly want to contribute to science. They don't want, let's say, brain imaging. They don't want to come to the scanner and go through the effort of basically donating their brain images if it's just for that research project and just for that that research group. What is it so special that only this small group of scientists can actually use my brain imaging data? I'm very happy if my data would go to, Stanford or Oxford or wherever prestigious group that they can actually use it and produce new findings. And then of course there's the perspective of the researcher, because the researcher understand of course that transparency is important, but they also see the reality in other countries. I've heard many researchers say that it is too difficult to work with this data in Europe. Why I might seriously consider, and some seriously did consider, to move to a less strict country. I've added a citation there of an example where in the paper there they collected loads of fingerprints, so like images of the fingers, and the data is publicly available. But of course they went to to villages in Africa to collect this fingerprint. So you see here, because of course we will live in a connected world, there are, you know like there are basically researchers who are happy to leave Europe if they can do more research, or that they go and collect data in other countries where the regulation is less strict, so that they can share it without going through any ethical or legal process. And then there's also some sort of a selfish, if you want to say it like that, issue that it's obvious that you get more citation if you can open the data. Whatever you can open along with the publication will bring citations. Opening the code, opening the protocol will bring citations, but it's clear that having also a paper cited because people are able to reuse the data is a great benefit. And then many many researchers, of course, they don't wanna say that they can't share the data. You often see this type of statement: data available on reasonable request. If I review a paper and I see that, I ask to remove reasonable, because what is an unreasonable request? And if you know what is an unreasonable request, maybe it should be explicitly written. If it's unreasonable that, I don't know, Google or Microsoft OpenAI request access to your data because they want to trade a new whatever AI model of everything, maybe, maybe that is the unreasonable request and maybe it should be written. So we still lack some sort of a so-called data use cases where the reuse of data could be better specified. But now the best that we can see is this type of statements: data available on reasonable request, and then just hope for the best that you can contact the first author and maybe after a few months get access to the data. And all this, of course, is also an issue of sustainability, because data sets can be very expensive. If I think of brain imaging, we're talking about some 500 or a bit more per hour. And some other, if I think of other medical images, let's say PET images can be 3,000 euros per subject. So, it is lots of money if you are building a data set with 100 subjects. So reusing this type of expensive data sets, it's clearly a benefit, not just for the researcher that we see the perspective here, but also for the whole society. All right, so personal data and the FAIR principle, just to make sure, most likely all of you here know that the FAIR principle are at the core of open science. And so if one reads the FAIR principle with the perspective of personal data, the findable, of course, is maybe kind of the easiest, in a sense that findable doesn't mean necessarily that it's actually accessible, but there are many different ways of depositing the so-called metadata, so the description about the study and the description about the data. Of course, I do hope that the data are actually findable, not just the metadata, so that hopefully every organization has a internal process, for example, where they know where the specific data set is. Then the A of the FAIR principle when it comes to personal data, it's of course controlled access. This is why often I'm not really talking about opening personal data, but more about sharing. Control access because it goes and follows the principle of privacy, the principle of the data protection that I mentioned earlier. And of course, this also becomes an issue because control access means that who decides who to give the access, and also technically how do we implement this control access. There are some repositories, let's say it's Zenodo, that would allow this type of control access, but it might be, it would be better to have something that is specifically designed for this type of data. And then there are the reusability, of course. This is where you are the expert. It requires field-specific knowledge and experiment-specific knowledge. And with the interoperability, it means already preparing the data in a way that other people can read it, other people can reuse it. So for example, if I still keep the example of brain imaging, the bits format would be, a good demonstration of this. In general, though, when we're not talking about personal data, the opening data always, and if not very often, means CC0, so Creative Commons 0. Many repositories pick this as the default license that the data distributed with. I don't know what is the history of this. It would be nice to go back in the past and see why the CC0 started to be. Of course, it's understandable because it allows for commercial reuses and it's kind of aligned if you think of the open source licenses. But on the other hand, it also means absolutely no limitations for reuse. So dual use is allowed if anyone wants to use that specific open data for military purposes. They are allowed. Is this in contrast with the data protection and with ethics? This is, of course, a question that I don't have answers, but this is also something of licensing that people are starting to 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 basically consider that the limit of the data that is out there or the code that is out there maybe should also take into account what types of reuses would need to can be allowed. All right, but okay, we understand the issues and we understand that we have motivated subjects. What if we could just ask for this motivated subject, just give me a broad consent. Just tell me that we can do whatever we want with your data, and let's not worry too much about it because you signed the broad consent paper. So of course, it would be ideal to do like that, and many biobanks for many years have been working with this type of broad consent, but this is not falling under the GDPR or in the data protection framework where we are working. So it's also an ethical issue. It's not just a legal issue. If legally we are not able to ask for this broad consent, also ethically, it's very difficult to ask for a permission and for a future study that we do not yet know what that will be the purpose of the study. And the ethical issue and the legal issue of the broad consent has been discussed by the European Data Protection Board in the beginning of 2021, I think. Yeah, 21. They released this statement related especially on the broad consent for scientific research. And in practice, they're saying that no, we cannot use broad consent, but they promise to give an updated interpretation of this issue. Right now, it's been 2 years and we still haven't seen a statement. Of course, the European Data Protection Board is busy with many other things, but in general, it's clear, also given previous documents by the European Data Protection Board on the use of consent in scientific studies, that there are upcoming solutions where a controlled reuse, a limited but yet broad purpose of reuse of data is actually possible. All right, so what can we do in the meantime while we wait for this European Data Protection Board to issue these new guidelines on processing personal data for scientific research purposes? I guess that in the meantime, we need to think of a process for enabling data sharing and reuse of personal data, because we must make sure that the personal data follows the FAIR principles and it's findable and especially accessible on request. And we also need to make sure that we have a process inside each organization that that someone knows where the data is deposited, someone knows what can be done with the data. You can understand, of course, that this requires different parties to be involved, especially considering that sometimes the researchers might leave, they might go to a different institution, but the data might stay, because often the data, the so-called controllership of the data stays in the organization where the data was originally collected. And then also, when you think of reusability and and the interoperability, we need to make sure that the data are already prepared using the best practices. It's not just some random folder hidden in some secure storage that has all the data, but even though it might not already be uploaded somewhere else, but it is stored, let's say, using some standards that are specific to the fields. And then when this is in place and when it's clear that the risks for the subjects are very small, then one can stipulate a contract. So the GDPR again doesn't say that data cannot be transferred to third parties. It just forces you to be more explicit about it, where data are going to go, and is this third party receiving the data granting the same level of data protection that we have in Europe, for example. So this often is done through contracts, and also there, it's something between both parties. It's a contract that both parties are signing. And then finally, when the kind of the ethical and legal issues are solved, we need an IT system, a computational system for securely sharing this type of data. Of course, in all these pictures, it's still unclear what are these requesters allowed to do with the data, and where's ethics in this type of process. So for understanding the different steps and how this process could be implemented in universities and other research institutes, we could think of this pyramid of ethically and legally sharing research data with personal data. So at the very bottom, we have the ethical and legal approval. The ethics review process should explicitly mention already from the very beginning. So we're talking about before collecting the data. Ethic review should discuss about the reuse and the sharing of the data, and it should be a discussion that is not going to end like don't share anything, that's it. It should be a discussion that we need to make sure that there is a way to ethically share this personal data. There are, of course, some very rare cases, very rare diseases, or studying celebrities that maybe it's too risky for the subject to to make the data fully open. But this is a discussion that should happen with the ethic board. Some organization might not have ethical review process. They might have some sort of a legal process or research permit process, but also there should be explicit statement in the legal process that consider this transfer to third party. I can say that we were successful at Aalto. In now the privacy notice of all the new studies, we clearly say that data can be given to third parties for peer review purposes, for validation purposes. This is still limiting because the purpose is still the same. So we're running a very similar analysis that is related to the research question. So we can't yet write in the privacy notice new purposes. But in general, it's the ethical and legal solution can be there. Then when it comes to this extending the purposes, so adding more purposes in the genomic field, in genetics, they talk about data use ontologies, which means that there can be a standardized way of telling what types of purposes some data set could be used for. Can it be used for, I don't know, basic research related to the original question, or maybe can it be used for developments of methods? Can it be used for, you can think of different uses for this data set. Open issues, of course, are still there. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that sometimes the data is so sensitive that shouldn't basically leave the building. But even in those cases, there could be solutions, for example, granting an access to a specific person using some remote desktop environment, or also something so-called federated analysis, that maybe the researchers who want to use this very sensitive data, they could give you the code to run on the data, and then you, or not you, but let's say the the research services from the university can run the code, produce the results, see if the results can be harmful for the subject, and if not, give the new results to those who have requested access to the data. Then there is the consent for reuse, and this is another difficult part, because here it's not about, you know, legal or ethical experts. You see that this all these steps of the pyramid are color coded to see the people that should be involved in the discussion. This is where the researchers need to talk with the subjects. It's important to make understand that what the subjects are doing is very important, and it's also important to make them part of the research process. I find it very unethical if we just invite someone to our experiment and show them, 2 pages of GDPR privacy notice and 1 page of ethics consent, and they have to, what can they do? They are there, they want to take part to your study, they will just sign what you ask them to sign. This is the same thing where every day you click accept to the cookies in whatever browser you browse, or you most likely never read what are the new terms of use changes in Google or Facebook or Instagram or whatever. So in practice, you know, even though it's common practice in companies to just, we updated our privacy notice, we updated our terms of use, and nobody reads them. Here, there should be a dialogue. If there is an update on the privacy notice, maybe the subject should be informed. If you don't have any way to contact these people anymore, there could be a public page in the university, or there could be, even better, a page related to this research project, that subject, even after many years, they can see, okay, where did my data go? Oh, they used it in this study, and they used it also in this other paper. Something that motivates the subject and also gives them, clear, keep them very close to the research, and that they can actually see where the data went and how was it used and what findings were found from that data. This process that I'm advocating is very similar to the patient and public involvement process that is common in medical research, which means that even again before the actual data collection, there is an active discussion with the group of subjects that you want to use. They understand the importance of the research, and they understand that they want to stay up to date with the research and maybe see in 1 year or 5 years where their data was reused and what benefited, what new advances in science were possible. Then the data preparation, this starts, the higher we go, the easier it gets, in my opinion. So data preparation here, it's more like in many fields, or at least in few fields, let's say, there are some standards to follow. The issue, of course, is that it's sometimes too demanding to have the researcher that is often a doctoral researcher that has to, write the paper, collect the, or sorry, let's go in order, collect the data, analyze the data, write the code for doing the analysis, make the figures, write the paper, go through peer review. It's lots of work, and sometimes data preparation, in the sense of reusability and interoperability, it's tedious. And because there are no incentives, nobody's forcing you to prepare the data in a specific standard format, sometimes people don't have time for doing it. The same goes with anonymization, that yes, there are tools and techniques to remove some identifiers, but once again, if you know, or not if you know, if you think that the data will not be shared, then I'm not saying that people are lazy, but sometimes they don't remove these direct identifiers because they don't have time, because they are already overloaded with many other things. So again, open issues: who checks that the data are identified, who checks that they are, prepared for reuse, that they are following some standardized format. Then the request for access, and this is also something that there was an example from the Donders that is linked there. I was trying it earlier, but it didn't work. But maybe you have access to the slides, so you can check it later. But this is also something very important, that the request for access to the data does not mean sending an email to the author, to the email address in the paper and hoping for the best. Every organization should have a page where, request for access for this paper that is affiliated with this organization, and the researcher should not actually know that they requested for access. This is what they did at the Donders, because sometimes, I mean, I'm not saying people have enemies or or friends, but there might be some bias, like unconscious bias, that maybe some researchers are competitors, and if you, the researcher, the first author of the paper, get a request for access, maybe you ignore it, maybe you unconsciously, maybe it takes you 6 months to reply to the request for access. So if the request for access instead is handled by a data steward, then we know that the original researchers should not even be contacted, because most likely, or ideally, the data steward university knows where the data is deposited internally, and then can check what are the new purposes for this request for access. Do they have ethical review? Ideally, it would be very nice if all these requests for reuse would come with a pre-registration plan, with a public pre-registration plan, because then not only the data steward of the organization, or the legal team of the organization, or the ethical team of the organization can check that these are real researchers from a real university with a real research question. Also, the scientific community can see that if I post a pre-registration where I'm saying I want to reuse this and that data set collected in this organization because I want to do this and that, it makes it more transparent for everyone that I'm committed for an ethical reuse of this data, and you can read my pre-register plan. Of course, again, the open issues is that you can already see this level here as so many different colorful boxes. That there's so many people who need to act on this request for access, and then who checks it, who approves, what should be the internal process, should the ethics committee, if exists a local ethics committee, have a say, should how do we do this? So this ideally would be that it's a standardized process that is the same across organization in Europe at least, but maybe it will take few years before we see that. And then if everything is in place, the data can be reused, the purpose of reuse are clear and they are aligned with the original purposes, and the data is prepared and the subject have understood that data can be reused and given to third parties, then this is just a standard data processing agreement. Sometimes, of course, there can still be issues. Unfortunately, some countries are somewhat blacklisted, where they're not considered, how can I say, that where basically personal data, European personal data, is not allowed to go in those countries. But even in the worst case scenarios, agreements can be made so that, for example, maybe the data is not actually leaving the institution or Europe, but then people can get remote desktop access with this type of secure desktop system, virtual desktop interfaces, or as I mentioned earlier, some sort of federated, that they basically send the code that could be used for the reanalysis, and then a local team analyzes the data again and gives the results back. And then the access. So when everything is in place, well, basically this is what I was just saying, whether it's that one can actually copy the data or get this remote desktop access or these federated approaches. All right, I'm basically done, but maybe the last thing that we should consider is that who pays for all of this. It's clear that it's not enough that we get the EU or whatever Ministry of Education that's saying sharing the data is important. When it comes to personal data, there's so many other, there's so many extra steps and tasks that I've listed here that, they cost time, the time of the poor junior researchers, because it's most likely them but also the time of the people in the organizations. So different, different players in the organization, they need to, have a saying if a certain data set can be reused. So maybe possible solution to this would be that maybe data appraisal should start immediately. Okay, maybe it's difficult to open all the data sets that are coming out from universities, but maybe, let's pick one and start working on it. Also, we could make mandatory sharing of detailed protocols and methods so that it would be very easy for others to recollect the same type of data. This would be great, but again, often the methods and the protocols are just a couple of sentences in a paper. And when share is not possible, we can bring the code, we can have these secure environments. And as I already mentioned earlier, people and experts from different teams are needed. And so, it's also expensive because then organizations need to invest in this, research support services, and which is not trivial, also to integrate within the organization. And then in general, the data collection initiatives, multi-site data collection initiative would be great. So if, for example, this is a message maybe for the grant, for those organizations that provide grants, that they could enhance, data collection initiatives. All right, maybe I took a little bit longer than I was expecting, but in general, the 4 take-home messages that I have is that not sharing research data containing personal data is bad, and so you need to do anything. You need to be as ready as possible for opening or reusing and sharing that data. Protecting the subject should not come at the expense of the transparency and reproducibility. This is clear. It depends on case by case, but in general, there is a way to ensure transparency and reproducibility. All these different teams of researchers, legal, ethics, service teams from an organization, they need to work together with this complex process and also inform together the study participants. So there needs to be a dialogue with the actual study participant. And sharing everything costs, so data appraisal is also something that is important. I am done. In the slides, I will repaste the link to the slides in the chat. There is a link to our future seminars that you can check. For example, I'm giving a workshop on hands-on workshop on data anonymization on Zoom, so you're all welcome to join there. Okay.
Okay, so thanks, Enrico. It's Vittorio from Trento. I'll try to share the question and answer session. I would, so if it's okay with you, maybe you could stick with sharing your screen.
Yeah.
So we can reference the slides and so on. And I invite all the people to follow the indication we posted in the chat. There are many ways in which you can ask questions.
Maybe it was so clear. There's no questions, but in general.
I mean, yeah, your presentation was really clear and very interesting. But I think there are, so it opens many issues, I would say. Have already, maybe I could start with a sort of, so it's more like asking you for an opinion, because first of all, I love Donder's repository. I think it's one of the best all over Europe. I think so what I would ask you is whether what you think about the importance of metadata with respect to the data themselves, and whether these initiatives like data repositories or in general the open data or the open data sharing movement should underline the attention with respect to metadata instead of the data themselves, because in my opinion, when you browse around, for example, for data sets and so on, the very first information that you're browsing, it's metadata itself. So I'm not saying that it's not important to share data, but in my opinion, metadata are, let's say, the very first information that you browse, and you can learn lots of things from metadata themselves without even going to the data. So my question would be whether you think that, for example, in setting a repository up, maybe you can work on solution for just the metadata and then leave the data sharing and downloading to another moment.
Yeah.
I think this is something that is also related to the cold data sharing, something like you browse around a representation of the data and then maybe in a second moment later on you download the data themselves. But
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with you in a sense that especially this cold data sharing, because it's expensive. I didn't mention it here, but it's also expensive to maintain these repositories of live data that I can just, now log in somewhere, click and start downloading a full data set, the UK Biobank or the Human Connectome project. But maybe it shouldn't be like that. That maybe it would be more efficient and even sustainable for the planet and for everyone that these requests, that these download requests, they don't need to be click and download. They can be cold storage sharing, but it's important that they're findable. I don't have an answer in a sense that it starts to become field specific, because if I think of neuroimaging, which is my field, neuroimaging is quite advanced. We have a good metadata structure, so I can already see ideal databases where I can search for, let's say, MRIs that have a specific repetition time or a specific sequence, so that that I can download data that have a similar protocol, or if in cognitive neuroscience, the similar cognitive task. But then with other fields, let's say interviews in qualitative research, it might be more tricky. Of course, also there might be some sort of taxonomies or ontologies that could, that one could basically identify similar topics, but it gets more difficult to find the right data that you need. I know at least when it comes to the Nordics, to Finland, for example, that there are repositories for this type of interviews data that one can basically search, and then also there understand what type of data use agreement one can have. But then then it becomes, the challenge is to have meaningful metadata, that it goes beyond something that you can read already yourself from the data, but that makes the data more discoverable in general. But I guess that at least the main blocker, if I want to highlight it, is it's still this consent for reuse. So a few years ago, I was one of the author of this open brain consent. Again, I bring the case of neuroimaging, but the brain consent, at least with the legal people that we discussed it with, was kind of deemed not compatible with the GDPR, because the open brain consent follows this type of broad consent that the European Data Protection Board clearly doesn't want us to use. But on the other hand, it's if we researchers and subjects can agree on what can be done with the data, that maybe they don't need to consent for anything, but they could still consent for a limit type of reuses. I would say that, if a solution can be found here, then this is really, enabling everything else. Right now at Aalto University, and I hope other universities are doing the same, we explicitly write in the legal document, in the privacy notice, that data will be given to third parties for peer review purposes and reproducibility validation. So it is obvious that, that the data will leave the building for peer review and reproducibility. And this is already a great step ahead, whether earlier you can just say, sorry, I can't, you can't even know that the data exists because I can't give you access to anything. So this is the first step, and it's understandable also for the subjects that it's important to verify, that other people need to verify the numbers, and maybe from that step we can move, to purposes that are closer to the original one. I don't know if others here, how did you solve, or if you are solving, this type of broad concept, asking for the data reuse, but this is very tricky legally and ethically.
It is indeed. I mean, I had been writing down the consent form for for CIMEC Research Center. Even if there are still several areas that I'm not completely sure that they are, let's say, this was actually another question that I had for you. So being too specific, I think it is something that you already mentioned in your talk itself. So being too specific in writing down the consent, being, let's say, having these long pages, the participants, they should read because it's their data. I don't know if it's something that is going to disrupt this kind of trust relationship between the researcher and the participant. The participants themselves. We wrote down several possibilities for the data themselves, including the fact that they could be after re-identification. I know that you're an expert in re-identification and avoiding singling out the data, but then I think in order to say everything, then it could be sometimes it's this kind of trust relationship, something like, okay, I'm giving you my availability to participate to your research. It's then a little bit disrupted, or at least participants, they could start being not that comfortable in participating to the research itself because of this kind of extra detailed and expanded and all the worst case scenarios written down consent forms.
Yeah.
So it's.
I think that's also for us who might be working with this social sciences or in general personal data, like I described earlier. There's lots to learn from the people who work with genomic data that often are closely to people, with biobank. And again, biobank often is samples collected for medical purposes, but not always. Of course, there are also genetic studies that where the data is originally collected not for a medical purpose. And so in general, this is the European Genome Phenome Archive. This is a complicated graph. We don't need to go there, but it's clear that different roles of people, they can talk or they can interact between the data and the repository, so that the type of control can be, very fine grained. So we have the submitter who deposits the data, but then we might have, the data steward who can basically as the saying on the actual data, and then, the requester might come and needs to have an access application, have an agreement, you see, with the data, with the original organization. And all this is done following, for example, these data use ontologies, so that the original subjects that are not in this picture here, they know that, let's say, this type of data can be used, I don't know, for cancer research. So any cancer research can request access for the data. It still needs to be approved somewhat by this data access committee. But then, if it's a clear requester, if it's a clear purpose, then the access is granted. So of course, genomic data is expensive, and it's great that they have these systems, but it would be nice to have something like this, maybe smaller scale for, medical images, or at least these brain images for for research purposes or any other, you know, bodily, medical, non-medical data that people might collect, whether it's, I don't know, video games or behavioral studies in general. So yeah.
Other questions? Thanks in the meantime for your thorough response.
Yes, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah,
hello,
go ahead.
Very interesting talk. My concern is regarding, for example, we are getting requests for stimuli, for example, if they're audiovisual, like, is my image going to be all over the place forever and ever, and everyone can use my pictures, my videos are recorded not only for like in data collection, but also as stimuli, for example. And we don't know exactly what to say. Like, it depends on the repository, it depends. So do we need that broad consent from them? Like, your stimuli is going to be all over the place?
Yeah, I think, well, so if I understand correctly, is it that you're filming a research participant and then the film becomes a stimuli, or is it that you're filming actors that are preparing?
Yeah, both. We have both cases. Like, you record different types of stimuli at the beginning, and obviously they sign a consent form, and then participants, maybe as part of the data collection, we need to record their voice or their or a video or even sign language issues as well, where, you know, they cannot be anonymized that easily to be uploaded to a repository. So we are getting.
Yeah, well, at least I would separate that, you know, that they say that the stimuli that are not research data itself, then it's say, you know, a film that you do with some actors, there are different legal bases for doing those. So you know, there are movies coming out all the time, and people can post, you know, can interview people and show their faces and voices in television. But this is kind of, it doesn't follow what happens with the research data. Then, as you already said, it's different instead when the video recording is actually the data, the research data. I would say that in this framework, you know, we can include cases where anonymization is impossible, because you know, blurring the face would be, you know, it's the face maybe that is really needed, and all the facial expressions. Doesn't make any sense to blur it. Of course, it just requires extra effort. If I think of some of the solution that I've seen, this control access, so that, you know, I grant you access to a remote desktop interface, and you can log in and, you know, see the videos, annotate them, and whatever you need to do, even though the videos, you know, are fully not anonymous. But then, you know, that this is also why maybe some repositories don't want to take everything that, you know, it's clear that this is a repository that is clearly designed for something that is very sensitive, and, you know, I don't want to upload to, let's say, Zenodo some videos of some participants, even though I know that I could set that no one can download it. But Zenodo, it's telling us already that, you know, it's not designed for storing this type of personal data.
So I understand that from, like, one of the best solutions is like a very good analysis at the beginning, so before performing or running the experiment, and then taking a close look to what repositories you uploaded to, correct?
Yeah, like or in some cases maybe there's not yet a repository that would allow that type of confidentiality. I don't know now in which country you work, but for example in Finland. Spain, okay. In Finland, for example, they are planning to have some sort of a Zenodo for sensitive data, so that the storage requirements are more secure. It's kind of similar to this type of. They actually, the first step is actually to work with this European Genome Phenome Archive, so that, you know, that there is a secure space where the data is actually stored, data that, you know, that could have these direct identifiers like faces, and then, you know, all this type of orchestration of different players that would open, you know, the different paths that you see in this picture.
Okay, and just my last question, sorry, thank you very much for this. So you said, as far as I understood, that the open brain consent doesn't go in line too much with the European law, correct, or the GDPR?
Yeah.
So there's no solution there yet.
Well, I mean, it's because that the open brain consent is one of these broad consent forms, and in the right it clearly says, you know, that we do not know who will use your data for what purposes. You know, we cannot guarantee that your data will not be used, let's say, for dual purposes, for military purposes. And so, and that goes against the Article 5 of the GDPR, where you need to specify, you know, the purpose of data collection. And you can't just say, we will collect your data and everything will be done with your data and will be given to everyone, which is silly because maybe some subjects really want, you know, to to give their data to everyone.
Yes, it's very, very tricky. Yeah, but we're in a very difficult position here.
There would be a way out that we are actually doing ourselves. If you measure yourself, then you have the right to put your own data anywhere you want. So we are measuring ourselves, and we know that at the end of the process, we can upload the data, you know, fully open for Google and Microsoft to data mine. But we don't care because we know on the other end that we will, you know, that the data set will be reused. But these are extreme cases of, you know, that it becomes difficult to ask every subject that they upload, you know, their data and they publish their data.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a great talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Hopefully it's useful.
Thank you.
Other questions? Sweet, like a few seconds more, and then I don't know if Michela wants to wrap this up.
Okay, if there are questions, let me say some concluding remarks on today's seminar. Gabriele, please, can you share this last slide? Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, Enrico, for your very interesting and very informative presentation. It was full of practical tips for handling the issues of sharing our data in an open way. Also, let me thank you, all of you in the audience, for attending today's seminar. We are very happy to have always such a big audience to attend. And for those of you that request the certificate of attendance, this certificate will be sent by email within the 7 next days. So be patient, and it will arrive. Also, let me say that next month's speaker will be Iraste Puebla, who is going to talk us about the revision process and preprints. And also, finally, I would like to remind you that we will inform our ETRN members via email when today's video of today's seminar will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So to stay updated. And thank you very much, all of you.